In the summer of the year 2000, my now deceased brother and I decided that we would take a road trip. It wasn't going to be long, just 3 to 5 days at the most, but we did all sorts of preparing ahead of time. We saved up enough cash for hotel rooms, budgeted enough money for gas and food. We were really looking forward to it. The one thing I hadn't told him was that we had a stop off for one night in Pittsburgh. I managed to score a couple of tickets to a WCW show in secret, and I was planning to surprise him. On top of that, we had never been to Pittsburgh before. My brother being a wrestling fan, he was always mentioning how badly he wanted to check out Kurt Angle's stomping grounds, so the wrestling tickets were just a bonus. Even though I was 22 and he was 19, we still maintained pretty constant contact with our mom and dad. We made sure to let them know what the itinerary was, minus the WCW show, because again, I didn't want to spoil the surprise. Back in the 80s, my dad worked as a traveling salesman. He'd seen a fairly good portion of America's back roads, and he was familiar with Pennsylvania. He wrote down some suggestions of places for us to check out along some of the back roads. The wrestling show wasn't going to be until 3 days into our trip, so I figured why not. My brother and I piled into my ridiculous souped-up Civic. Yes, I was one of those guys in my youth. Then we hit the open road with a fresh sense of adventure in our minds. At first, everything was going great. We followed one of my dad's suggestions, and I decided we would make a pit stop in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in order to check out the Amish country. We stopped off at a little Amish-owned restaurant that was open to tourists. We had possibly the best lunch of our lives up until that point. Sorry, Mom. We took in the rolling farmland, and I can say we were loving what we saw, but then I looked up in the sky, and I saw some angry-looking clouds forming. Going with my gut, we got back in the car, and I suggested finding a hotel in order to wait out the storm. Then we could get some much-needed rest. My dad's directions were well written, but they left out some of the more important things, like gas stations and places to rest. Bear in mind, this was our first time taking a road trip that we could actually call substantial. As the rain started to come down, we noticed pellets mixed in amongst the drops, and realized it was starting to hail. I'd be lying if I didn't say I felt a little bit of panic in this scenario. I didn't like driving in the rain to begin with, and hail just compounded the situation. I knew we needed to find a place to pull over, and we needed to find it as soon as possible. As we were driving along, we saw police lights. An officer in a yellow rain slicker was waving traffic down a road on the left. From what I could gather, another vehicle must have lost control during the storm, and the accident was bad. I do remember seeing a white sheet covering something next to the flipped-over sedan on the side of the road. I checked my rearview mirrors. There were a couple of cars behind me, but I had enough distance between us to roll my window down ever so slightly. I asked the police officer if he could please direct us to a hotel. I quickly explained that this was our first time in the area and that we were hopelessly lost. The officer had a tone to his voice like an understanding father, and he gave us decent directions to a little motel, not too far up the road, 3 miles away at most. My brother and I thanked him for those directions, and we took the detour. I was trying not to focus on the fact that the rain was coming down in violent torrents. I was keeping my eyes on the road, but trying to find stuff to focus on as I was driving, and I spotted something strange. Most of what we were driving through was a series of sprawling cornfields. Not much to see, unless you're a fan of Stephen King. My brother jokingly quipped, "He who walks behind the rows." I didn't quite notice at the time, but his voice was a bit shaky. There was a sudden break in the cornfield on the right-hand side of the road, and we both noticed this derelict-looking farmhouse. It was absolutely consumed by the hands of time, but sitting in the front yard was an almost pristine 80s model Ford LTD. It was incredibly similar to the one my dad used to drive when we were kids. "Huh, weird," I said as I turned my attention to my brother. When I did so, I noticed he was starting to look gaunt, and he was incredibly shaky. One thing I didn't mention was that my brother was a sickly kid growing up. If there was a flu outbreak in my town, it was a guarantee he would catch it. Chickenpox? Yep, he had that at one point too. And the one thing that followed him around as a constant throughout his life was a type of reactive hypoglycemia. Even though we stopped off for lunch earlier that day, he must not have eaten enough. It had gotten to the point where I stopped asking him if he had something on him, in case his blood sugar took a dramatic dip. That's because in almost every case, he had a blow pop or a candy bar on him. Not this time though. He told me he figured we would stop off at a gas station at some point, then he could grab a couple candy bars and a Coke for the road. However, the currently raging storm and consequent detour threw a monkey wrench into those works. For those of us who grew up either with a blood disorder like diabetes or hypoglycemia, or have had relatives dealing with such, you know how scary it can be to be an outsider looking in. I was already panicking because the storm was getting progressively worse the further we drove. To add to that, I started worrying that my brother was going to pass out too. And in that momentary distraction, my car hit a patch of water that was going across the road like a little creek. My little Honda Civic got jerked to the side of the road. I successfully corrected my vehicle, but in the process of doing so, I ended up driving through the very end of the derelict house's driveway, spraying mud and rocks under my spinning wheels. I don't think we were a quarter mile away when I noticed that Ford LTD suddenly behind us, and it was gaining speed. Through rain and hail, the driver was hanging out of his window, yelling at us while shaking his fist. I got a look at his windshield, and I noticed some cracks that weren't there when we first saw the car. "Shit, this is all we need right now," I remarked. My brother and I were full on freaking out, and I knew this guy was pissed off at me because I sprayed rocks on his windshield and cracked it. I knew I had to pull over, but I was not going to do so until we got to the hotel. As angry as this guy was, I at least wanted witnesses in case things got out of hand, and got out of hand they did. Seconds later, he pulled himself back in his window and picked up speed. My brother and I knew what was going on, and we braced for impact. He smashed into the back of my little Civic. To this day, I still feel his attempt to force us off the road. Dangerous road conditions or not, this guy was far more dangerous than the weather, and in an admittedly adrenaline-fueled stupid decision, I put my pedal to the metal. We were driving down this country road in the middle of nowhere, at a speed that screams death wish. There was some nutjob and a much larger and much heavier vehicle attempting to ram us a second time. We started to notice the road widening, and so did he. He pulled up next to us and maintained speed. I looked through his passenger side window, and he was rapidly yelling at us while shaking his fist. He reached for the glove box, but then I suddenly hit my brakes to let him keep going ahead of us. I didn't want to know what he was reaching for, but I had a good guess. He gained some distance by about 500 or 600 feet and kept moving forward. Eventually, his taillights disappeared into the distance. Me being a bit younger and a bit more naive, I figured maybe he had just let things go and decided to keep moving. As I continued to drive, I said out loud to my brother that this was the longest 3 miles of my entire life. Just as I finished that sentence, we saw this guy in the Ford parked in the middle of the road. He got out of his car and he had something in his hand. I didn't slow down. I swerved and drove past him. Then I heard a pop. I realized my car was suddenly struggling to move. Then I heard the grinding, and I realized I was driving on a rim. That guy shot out my back tire. While all of this insanity was going on, my brother was fading. He needed to get something in his system to get past this hypoglycemic attack. We needed to get somewhere safe in order to contact either the local police department or the highway patrol. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw sparks coming out from under my car. My muffler was dragging on the road, and the sounds of my rim grinding were getting louder and louder. Still checking my mirrors, I saw this guy back in his vehicle, and he was gaining speed on us again. But as luck would have it, we spotted the hotel on the horizon. We pulled into the parking lot like a couple of maniacs and drove around to the back of the hotel. We parked between 2 large pickup trucks in an empty spot and got out of the car quickly. Not the smartest move, I know, but we figured the quicker we got into the hotel lobby, the better. Sometimes at night, when I'm trying to sleep, I close my eyes and I can still hear the rumble of this guy's engine. We both walked over to the breezeway connecting the hotel lobby and the adjoining rooms. We saw this guy practically coasting next to the hotel, as if he was trying to find our vehicle. Thankfully, he didn't spot us, and he continued to speed off down the road in the direction he was initially driving. My brother and I got into the hotel lobby, and we must have looked like a couple of escaped mental patients. He was completely out of it, and I was yelling and stammering, trying to explain what happened. The motherly woman working at the front desk gave me a moment to calm down, and I told her everything word for word. My brother mentioned that he was hypoglycemic, and that he was in the middle of an attack. Thankfully, the woman knew exactly what to do, and she gave him a handful of Starlight mints. He popped one into his mouth and sat down on the faux leather couch in the lobby, then waited for his blood sugar to regulate. She then handed me the phone and told me the phone number to the police department. I called and reported everything. It didn't take long for the officers to get there, and I explained to them how I lost control of my vehicle due to the weather and more than likely damaged this guy's windshield by spraying rocks onto it. Of course, they sympathized with us. We were just a couple of kids that had a harrowing near-death experience, thanks to some psycho with a driver's license. We told the police that we were going to go ahead and get a room for the night in order to wait out the storm and survey the damage done to my vehicle the next day. They asked us to stay put so they could send an officer out in the morning to speak with us again. They told us they were going to look for the vehicle, but in all of the chaos, I never got a license plate number. When I mentioned where the guy was initially parked before everything unfolded, the officer told me he was familiar with that address and it had been abandoned for years. However, it was a known meet-up spot for some drug dealers in the area. Everything boiled down to a wrong place, wrong time situation. Looking at my vehicle, it was no secret that it was absolutely totaled. Between being rammed and my tire being shot out, forcing me to drive on the rim, I could see the back portion of my vehicle's frame beginning to warp. My dad, being the man he is, had a membership with AAA covering all of the vehicles. Even though he would still have to pay a fee for them to tow my vehicle all the way back home, it would have been much worse had the membership not been a thing. I got in contact with my insurance company, AAA, and a rental car company shortly after checking out of the hotel. My brother and I waited until my car was on the back of a tow truck and the rental car was dropped off. We continued our road trip, but decided to drive home after the WCW show. After everything that went on that day, we had zero energy for sightseeing. I almost said screw it and didn't even bother with the wrestling show, but my brother came across the tickets. He was getting my registration for me while I was on the phone with the insurance company, and he came across them. God love him, he tried to play it off, but when I mentioned we were just going to go home, he flipped his lid and told me, "No way in hell, you paid way too much for those tickets, and we're going to at least enjoy something other than a nice Amish lunch." So we went home after the show. A couple of months went by, and I didn't hear anything back from the police in regards to this maniac. Thankfully, my insurance company bought the whole story, and they were able to give me enough on an insurance claim for me to buy a gently used Dodge Neon, but that call from the cops never came. Eventually, I called them with my report number, and I asked for any information with regards to the case. They mentioned that a vehicle fitting the description was found abandoned in a wooded area not too far from that abandoned house. When I questioned the officer as to why they hadn't informed me of that development, the officer simply remarked that they were hoping to call me and let me know that they'd made an arrest and not just found the vehicle. That was the last I heard of it. I don't know what happened to that guy. I don't know if the vehicle he was driving was stolen, if he managed to piss off a rival dealer and they dealt with him accordingly. I don't know if he decided to go off of the grid, not a damn thing. I will say this much. I still have nightmares about the whole scenario, going far differently than it did at the time. For a couple of years, it was enough to affect my sleep, and I eventually sought counseling. To no one's surprise, I was diagnosed with PTSD. My brother passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack. The autopsy results found he had an undiagnosed heart condition, and that more than likely played into all of the sickness when he was younger. I'm thankful for the time I got to spend with him while he was here, and I miss him every day. But other than the best chicken salad I've ever eaten, and the Vince Russo train wreck that was the only WCW show we ever had a chance to see before the company folded, I don't look at the rest of that road trip with much fondness in my heart. In closing, I just want to say, Kyle, you were the best little brother a guy could have asked for. I really wish that trip could have gone any other way. I know you would have chastised me for beating myself up over a scenario that was far beyond my control, but I still feel as if I put you in harm's way. I can only be thankful that that idiot decided to forego pulling into that parking lot after giving it a good look over. I was driving taxis back in the late 90s, and many scary things happened to me. My main area was downtown Chicago, which is a big city. Crime was bad back then, especially when I had to do the late shift. I was a 23-year-old college graduate, but couldn't stomach the corporate life just yet. Once I was finished with my studies, I simply put off looking for a job to the point where I had to take something. My uncle was a taxi driver, and I decided to follow in his footsteps. I was working late on a weekend one night in the summer. The streets were usually busy until well into the morning, and this was no exception. That night, I parked near a bar that was still filled with people. The neon lights flickered on the outside, casting a dull glow on the wet pavement. I sat in my cab, watching people spill out onto the street, hoping for a passenger. Ahead of me was another taxi. It was a guy who I had seen around before. I didn't know him well, but we had spoken on a few occasions since we did work for the same company. He and I often parked in the same spots, picking up passengers from the same places. I was not there for more than 5 minutes before I noticed someone leaning into the driver's side window of the taxi in front of me. The body language seemed tense, and I wondered if it was a passenger trying to avoid paying. It wasn't uncommon, especially at this hour when people were drunk and belligerent. I thought about getting out to help, but it didn't seem too out of control just yet. I could just make it worse. Then I noticed another car parked in front of him, and another man got out and walked towards the cab. Now there were 2 of them standing there, berating this poor driver. The exchange between them grew heated, and things were escalating quickly. I was wondering why he didn't just drive away and call the cops later. And just when I had that thought, the taxi in front of me jolted forward. He was trying to leave. Just then, one of the men dove into the driver's side window, which must have been at least half open. Then, 2 loud bangs rang out. The inside of the taxi lit up, and I knew exactly what had happened. The man at the window got back to his feet and stumbled back. I couldn't tell who, if anyone, had been hit. Instinctively, I ducked down in my seat trying to hide. I stayed crouched down for a while, listening to the chaos outside. People were screaming, and a few scared souls ran past my window. I kept my head low for a while, but then peeked over the dashboard to see what was going on. It was surprisingly calm out there. Just the other taxi was ahead of me. The other car had taken off, and there were very few people around on the street. The driver of the other taxi was still in his seat. I could just barely see the top of his head through the back window. After a few moments, I grabbed my phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, a small crowd had gathered around the other taxi. I got out and joined them. As I looked through to the other car, I could tell that the other driver had been shot. There was a spatter of blood on the windshield of his car, and he was clearly in pain. The paramedics were already on the scene, and the cops cleared everyone away so that they could get to the injured guy. After that, I went back to my car so I would be out of the way. I waited around for the police, but they never needed anything from me, so I went back to work. I know it seems crazy to keep working after that, but the last thing I wanted was to be alone at home with my thoughts. The rest of my shift was quiet, with only a few passengers. The next day, I checked the news, hoping to find out more. They reported that the man who had been shot was in stable condition. It wasn't long after that the shooter was caught. It turned out that he wasn't even a passenger of the other cab. He was just some angry driver that lost his mind. He probably thought he got cut off or something. It's crazy to think of what will set some people off, but those people are out there. This happened last summer when my family was getting together for a bit of a reunion. We were having it at my older sister's house, which was out in the country. I was living in a bigger town that was about a 2-hour drive away. Not much happened at her house, but something happened when I was driving back. Me and my younger brother Joel were in the car. He was 18 years old and visiting after his first year of college. He was staying with me for part of the summer because I had an extra room at my apartment. We had been spending a lot of time together, and it was good to have him around. Joel had always been reserved and more of an introvert, so it was quiet in my car. He was exhausted anyway, so he was asleep in the passenger seat. The road we were on was a narrow highway, with just one lane in each direction. The darkness was thick, and the sides of the road were lined with farms and the occasional mansion that some rich person must have built. It was just past midnight, and it had been raining earlier, so there was a slick of water on the pavement that reflected some of the light back up. It was a little distracting, so I was taking it slow, probably going just under the speed limit. That would be considered slow for my town, because most people speed a lot on that highway. As I drove, I noticed a truck approaching from the opposite direction. It was swerving across the road wildly. He was weaving in and out between the lanes, and I was worried that he would crash right into me if I didn't do something. I instinctively flashed my high beams at him, then I beeped my horn. That didn't seem to help, so I slowed down and edged the car closer to the side of the road, trying to give him as much space as possible. I was completely on the shoulder to give the truck the entire road, but even with those precautions, it veered towards us and grazed the side of my car. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough to push the car off the road and into the ditch. We lazily drifted off the road and settled gently on the grass. I knew the car was still drivable, but I didn't know if we could get back on the road, especially with the wet grass underneath us. When the car stopped, Joel woke up. He looked disoriented and asked what had happened. I told him not to worry and turned off the engine. Then I told him that another car clipped us, and we had to deal with it. Then I pulled out my phone to check that we had service. I was getting bars, so it was looking like we could get help if needed. I sat there for a moment, hoping the truck would stop so we could exchange info. As I watched, the truck continued down the road, but then I saw in the rear view mirror that it stopped on the other side of the highway. It turned around and came towards us, then parked just a few car lengths away, but up on the shoulder. A man got out and started walking toward us. I assumed he was coming over to exchange insurance information, since the accident was clearly his fault. As he approached, I noticed he was a big guy, much taller and broader than me. His steps were heavy, and there was something off about the way he moved, but I still wasn't too concerned, even though I thought he was probably drunk because of the way he was driving. I told Joel to stay in the car while I stepped out to talk to him. When I got close enough to speak, I barely had time to say a word before he suddenly grabbed me by the jacket and shoved me up against my car. His grip was strong, and I could feel the cold metal of the car door pressing into my back. Joel, who was still in the car, started screaming. The man didn't hit me, but the look in his eyes was enough to make me realize he was furious. I was scared and knew I couldn't overpower him. His face was right up against mine, and the smell of alcohol on his breath was impossible to miss. He pulled me back towards him and away from my car, then he slammed me against it twice. The second time was so hard that it almost knocked the wind out of me. I screamed for Joel to call the cops, but the man kept hold of me. Then I felt his hands crawl up to my neck. I was kicking and screaming at that point, but it wasn't helping. As his hands started to choke me, I used my last ounce of breath to scream for Joel to get my gun from the glove box. I didn't even think about whether it was the right thing to do. It was just the only thing that came to mind. As soon as I said it, the man's grip loosened. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, it seemed like he was actually thinking straight. Then, without another word, he let go of me, turned around, and hurried back to his truck. I stood there stunned as he got into his vehicle and sped off into the night. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I couldn't believe that it was over so quickly. Then I heard the sound of Joel getting out of the car. He ran over to me and asked if I was okay. He told me that he called the cops, but that he couldn't find the gun. That was when I told him that I didn't even have one in the car. I am a gun owner, but I don't drive with it. Luckily, my bluff was enough to scare the guy off. I checked the car, and it was drivable, though the side was scraped up pretty bad. We got back in, and I drove back up on the road to wait for the cops. I never got a look at the license plate, but I described the truck. It was a dark blue Ford Ranger, an older model, probably with a busted front end. When we were done with the cops, I drove us the rest of the way home. We hardly said a word. The police found the other driver that night. From what I heard, he was arrested on the spot for drunk driving, and he was also charged for the initial accident, as well as for assaulting me. It has been over a year at this point, and the whole thing is still not settled legally. I was paid out by insurance, but the other driver is still out there. He belongs in jail, for sure. On a long weekend, I was heading out of state to visit an old friend of mine named Jason. We had known each other since grade school, but we had lived apart for close to 10 years at the time of this story. I was 25 years old, and I was working at a factory while taking college classes in the evenings. Jason had moved away from our hometown when we were in high school, but he and I kept in touch over the years. We had both lost touch with most of our other friends at the time, but for whatever reason, our friendship lasted. It was going to be a long drive, probably taking the whole day, so I planned to leave early and arrive in the evening. Since I was going alone, I knew the drive was going to be boring, so I had a few audiobooks ready to listen to on the way. The traffic was not so bad after I got out of the city, and I was making pretty good time. At around noon, I noticed a car behind me, really close. It was a beat-up, dark-colored station wagon. The driver was right on my bumper, not giving me any space at all. I tried to look at him in my mirror, and I was able to see his face because he was so close. All I can say about him from that glimpse is that he had a beard, and he was mad. I wondered if I had done something wrong, maybe cut him off. I really didn't think I did, but maybe that was what happened. It must have been something. I decided to slow down a bit to let him pass, but he didn't take the hint. Instead, he stayed right behind me, swerving slightly and getting dangerously close. It's a miracle that he didn't bump me. I was starting to get annoyed, so I switched lanes to let him go around. When he finally passed, I caught a glimpse of him through his window. He was yelling, and I could see him flipping me off. I didn't react and kept my eyes on the road. I kept driving throughout the day, and not much else happened for a while. I stopped at a fast food place for a late lunch at around 4 in the afternoon, and I was on the road again shortly. By around dawn, I was getting close to my friend's town, but my gas tank was dangerously low. I was pretty sure I could make it, but didn't want to leave my car empty, so I decided to stop for gas at the next opportunity. I pulled into a station just off the highway, a small place with just a few pumps and a convenience store. It wasn't busy, just a couple of other cars filling up, so I parked next to one of the pumps and got out. Then I started filling the tank. The sun was almost down, so it would probably be dark before I finally got there. I had one hand on the gas nozzle, and then I pulled out my phone to text Jason that I was close. Then I heard a car pull up to another pump a few spaces away. It was a dark blue station wagon that looked really similar to the one that was chasing me before. Then out of nowhere, I felt a hard shove from behind. I stumbled forward and dropped my phone onto the ground. However, I managed to keep my balance by gripping the gas pump. As soon as I turned around to see what happened, I saw a large man standing there. He was easily 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered. He looked furious, and it didn't take long for me to realize he was the same guy who had been tailgating me earlier. Before I could react, he came at me again. He looked really pissed off. I didn't have much time to think. He was coming at me fast, so I aimed the gas nozzle at him and squeezed the trigger. A stream of gasoline sprayed out, hitting him square in the chest. Then I moved it up to his face. He tried to get out of the way, but I followed him with it. To be honest, it was pretty satisfying. You would be surprised at the amount of pressure those things have. Even if he wanted to, I don't think he could have done anything to me. The smell of gasoline filled the air, and I could see his shirt soaking with it. The guy stumbled away and fell to the ground about 15 or 20 feet in front of me. At that point, I stopped spraying in order to save money. He looked at me with shock, as if he couldn't believe what just happened. I kept my grip on the nozzle, ready in case he tried to come at me again, but he didn't. He got up and took a few steps back, then went back to his car. By then, a couple of people at the gas station had noticed the commotion. Someone must have called the police because before I knew it, 2 squad cars pulled into the station. The officers got out, and one of them told me to freeze. The man who had attacked me stood there, drenched in gasoline, trying to explain himself, but the cops weren't having any of it. They separated us and started asking questions. I was still holding the gas nozzle when they had arrived, and I knew how it might look, but I explained what happened. The officer in charge nodded, but he didn't say much, just asked me to sit tight while they checked the cameras. After a few minutes, one of the cops came back. He said they'd seen the whole thing on tape. They saw that the guy had shoved me, and then came at me afterwards. They believed that I'd sprayed him with gas to defend myself. He didn't seem thrilled with my method of defense, though. The officer gave me a bit of a lecture, but said they wouldn't press charges, since it was clear I was acting in self-defense. After that, I was free to go. I got back in my car, still smelling like gas, and continued my drive to my friend's house. When I arrived, Jason had to cover his nose because the gas smell was so strong. I changed and took a shower right away, then told him what had just happened to me. We both had a laugh about it, but the truth is that I was really shaken up. I don't know what that guy was capable of, and the fact that he followed me all the way to that gas station was beyond creepy. I was scared on the road for a long time after this. This happened last year when I was a senior in high school. I had moved to a new city the previous year, so I was still the new kid. It was late in the year, though, so I had made some friends already. One of them was Darren, and he was one of the more popular guys at my school. One weekend, there was a party going on at someone's house. I didn't know her very well, but Darren invited me, so I went. Darren's brother dropped me and a few other people off at the party, which was actually really far away, almost an hour's drive. I was expecting it to be closer, and I was somewhat concerned about how I was going to get home. I wasn't close with most of the people there, but I recognized about half of them from school. Not long after we got there, Darren disappeared, and I pretty much didn't know anybody. I was talking to a girl named Claire for a while, and she mentioned that she lived close to me. I was still looking for a ride home that night, so I asked how she was getting home. She mentioned that she was getting a ride with a guy named Steve, who was staying sober that night. I went and introduced myself to him. He seemed like an alright guy, and he said that I could come with him. I even offered to walk from Claire's house, so it would be no extra trouble. Once we got into the car, things seemed normal at first. Claire was in the front seat, and there was one other guy in the back seat with me. We dropped him off first, and that's when things started to get weird. As soon as we pulled away from his house, Steve's driving became more erratic. He was swerving a little, nothing too crazy at first, but enough to make me nervous. It didn't take long to suspect that he'd been drinking after all. That's when I started to regret getting in the car. We were driving through some quiet streets, and I was trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to start an argument with Steve, but I also didn't want to keep riding with him if he was drunk. Before I could say anything, another car came up behind us and honked. Steve got pissed off immediately. He muttered some swearing under his breath and sped up. The other car tried to pass us, but Steve swerved to block it, a dangerous move. I was tense and clutching the handle of my door tightly. The other driver honked again and flashed his high beams. That set Steve off. He slammed his foot on the gas and started tailgating the other car, flashing his headlights and yelling out the window. Claire looked back at me, and she seemed scared too. She placed her hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him down, but it was impossible. He was beyond angry. It was the worst road rage I had ever seen. The other car eventually pulled up to a stoplight, and that's when Steve did something I didn't expect. He put the car into park, jumped out, and ran toward the other car. He started pounding on the driver's side window, screaming at the guy inside. When the light turned green, the other car took off, but not before something went wrong. As Steve kept pounding on the window, the driver must have panicked and hit the gas too hard. Steve wasn't ready for it, and the sudden movement knocked him off balance. He fell, and I saw him hit the ground hard. It happened so fast that I didn't fully understand what had gone wrong until I saw him lying there, clutching his leg. I jumped out of the car along with Claire. We ran over to Steve, who was clearly in a lot of pain. His leg didn't look right. It was twisted in a way that made me feel sick just looking at it. He was trying to move, but unable to get up. Claire and I knew that we needed to call for help, because he certainly couldn't drive. But Steve was insisting he was fine, and didn't want an ambulance. I think he was scared that if we called, then he would get in trouble for driving drunk. I could see he was scared, but there was no way we could leave him like that. I pulled out my phone and made the call for help. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics quickly assessed Steve's leg and confirmed what we already knew. He wasn't walking or driving anywhere anytime soon. They took him away, leaving me and Claire stranded. We were only about 20 minutes away from home at that point, so I called for an Uber and we made it home. I never heard anything about Steve again. Not many people from my school knew him, and I was just as happy to forget about him completely. He wasn't my kind of guy, anyway.